All right, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite topic, which is short-term mating. Um, we're gonna look at some sex differences with respect to short-term mating, propensity to engage in short-term mating, but also look at some of the reasons why both sexes would engage in short-term mating. So the first thing to point out is that men, I don't think this is news, but men are much more willing to have casual sex than women are. And this has been demonstrated many times in many different ways. But one of the classic studies is by Clark and Hatfield. Now, this was done on a college campus in the 80s, and they had an attractive man or woman confederate, or someone working for the experimenter, approach strangers of the opposite sex on campus. And this is kind of creepy, I guess, but they said, I've been noticing you around campus. I find you very attractive. And then they asked one of three questions, A, B, or C. Would you go out on a date with me tonight? B, would you come over to my apartment tonight? Or they were asked, would you go to bed with me tonight? Obviously, three very different questions. So again, this was done with men and women on a college campus. So what did they find for women when they were asked for a date? 50% said yes. As far as going back to the apartment goes, sharp drop there, 6% said yes. And when they were propositioned for sex, 0% agreed to that. So what do you think happened with the men? Men, 50% said yes to the date. Why only 50%? Well, because they probably feel like they'd have to pay for it, my guess, and because it's not very otherwise very promising, right? As far as going back to her apartment, 69% said yes, and a whopping 75% agreed to sex. And the 25% that said no, many of them were very apologetic for turning down this offer. So the huge difference between the sexes. And I've seen this replicated many times in many situations. I remember a news show once did a similar study. This was in a bookstore where guys were there with their girlfriends or wives and not necessarily standing close to each other, but close. And when the men were approached, even some of them agreed, even though their wife was, a few aisles away. So it's very stark and disturbing finding in many ways. So why should men be much more geared towards short-term mating? Well, it follows from Trivers' parental investment theory that we've discussed before. Right? Remember, it says that the sex that invests the most in reproduction should evolve to be the choosiest and less prone towards casual sex, right? While the sex that invests the least in reproduction should be much more opportunistic, right? They should consent quite readily because, there's very little cost involved. And since women face the brunt of the reproductive costs, they should be much more careful. Now, this doesn't mean that there are no costs associated with short-term mating for men. There are many such costs, and they help to put a brake on this kind of behavior. First of all, the risk of STDs increases dramatically with the number of partners that you have. And this isn't just an aesthetic thing. A lot of STDs can actually lead to infertility, which would obviously block the main evolutionary goal of reproduction. There's also the danger associated with acquiring a reputation as a womanizer. That makes you undesirable for many women who are looking for long-term mates. And also, if the woman is otherwise attached, there's violence from jealous husbands, boyfriends. And what if the guy's married and he engages in short-term mating on the side? Well, here he faces the risk of a retaliatory affair by his wife. and then he could end up unknowingly raising someone else's child. And there's also the huge cost of divorce, which can happen if he's caught. So there are costs, and this serves to put the brakes on short-term mating to a large extent. But there are huge differences among males in their likelihood of engaging in short-term mating. I know from my own experience, many of my friends, some of them are exclusively long-term mating guys, and others really have a hard time with that and pursue almost nothing but short-term mating. So there's a full range between these in terms of likelihood of engaging in this sort of behavior. But if a guy is going to pursue a short-term mating strategy, there are certain things that he has to do, right? Certain adaptive problems that he has to solve. First, you have to be less choosy, right? You have to, if you're going to pursue short-term mating and pursue as many women as possible, how do you do that? How do you gain access to a large variety of women? Well, the first thing you have to do is relax your standards. Standards of all sorts: personality, intelligence, attractiveness, political orientation. All of these things have to be tossed out the window, right? Because any standard that you impose will decrease the number of partners that you have. You also have to avoid spending or investing a lot of time in each individual mating, right? So as Buss says, we need to impose minimum time constraints before seeking sexual intercourse. That's why when we talk about conflict between the sexes, and we talk about how women protect themselves against guys who are only after for short-term mating, we'll talk about imposing a period during which they won't have sex, right? And a courtship phase is what we call it, right? If a guy is only interested in pursuing short-term mating, then he's going to lose interest if there's a courtship phase that's required. If you're going to pursue the short-term mating strategy, you also have to be able to identify women who are accessible, right? Since not all women are open to this prospect. So Buss says the men who do this, they avoid women who give the appearance of being prudish, probably by the way they dress. Avoid people who are sexually inexperienced, people who are conservative, or who appear to have a low sex drive, right? Because all of this would make it less likely to be a successful strategy. So for example, to illustrate this third point, Buss and Schmitt asked men to rate the desirability of different characteristics in both short-term and long-term mates. And what they found is that sexual experience and promiscuity were rated more highly in a short-term mate than in a long-term mate. So in many cases, what's desirable in a short-term mate is not desirable at all in a long-term mate. So for a short-term mate, things that men dislike include things like wanting a commitment, not having sexual experience, being prudish, and having a low sex drive. And here's the data. We have the means. So again, these things are rated on a -3 to +3 scale, positive numbers indicating desirability. And we have the means for short-term mating and long-term mating. And we can see that promiscuity is slightly positive, at least in the case of short-term mating, but it is negative in the case of long-term mating. And sexual experience is also viewed much more desirable in a short-term mate than it is in a long-term mate. And we can see at the bottom there for not sexually experienced, that's negative in the short-term mating and slightly positive in the long-term mating. Now, is short-term mating a thing of the present, right? Is it something that only modern humans do, living in a certain type of culture? Or is short-term mating a feature that has been around as part of our species for a long time? If it is part of the species, right, then we would expect to find adaptations designed for solving these short-term mating problems. So we're going to discuss physiological evidence and psychological evidence for a long evolutionary history of short-term mating among humans. One important source of physiological evidence has to do with testicle size. Right? The size of male testes provides evidence for what is referred to as sperm competition. You may not have heard this term before, but for sperm, it's war out there. Right? So sperm competition is the following. Right? The sperm of different males will compete to fertilize the egg of a given female, and any male whose sperm has some trait that gives it an advantage over the sperm of other males will have a reproductive advantage. Okay, so the idea is that a female may have the sperm of different males inside of her at any given point in time, and that's an opportunity for natural selection to kick in, and any trait that gives the sperm of one male an edge in fertilizing the egg will be selected for. Now obviously this only happens if short-term mating is part of the species, right? It happens only if some females have sex with more than one male within a relatively short span of time, right, within 5 days, because sperm can't live very long inside of a woman. So one advantage would be, one advantage for one male over another would be if one male can produce more sperm than the other, right? And the amount of sperm that can be produced is obviously related to testicular size. Right, so any evidence that a species has relatively large testicles is evidence for the promiscuity of that species. So where do humans fit into the grand scheme of things? So here we have 4 primates: humans, gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees. And their testicular size is given as a percentage of their body weight. And you have to make it relative to the size of the animal, since obviously bigger animals will have larger testicles, because everything that they have is larger, right? So it's relative to their body weight, right? You don't want to compare apples and oranges, so to speak. So what do we see? Well, first of all, surprisingly, gorillas have relatively small testicles, and same with orangutans. Humans are, larger relatively larger than gorillas and orangutans, but we also have a clear winner, which is the chimpanzee, right? Their testes are a much greater proportion of their body weight. And this corresponds to the promiscuity of the species. Right, so Wrangham, a famous anthropologist, he has provided evidence that links this testicular size to the propensity for amount of mating that people do. So human females have an average of 1.1 male sex partners per child that they give birth to, while chimpanzees, right, they have an average of 13 male sex partners per birth. Right, so there's no comparison. Chimpanzees provide many more opportunities for sperm competition than humans do. But humans are still much more promiscuous than some other primates. Further physiological evidence for sperm competition in humans is what's called variations in sperm insemination. Right? How much sperm is produced by a male when he has sex with a given female. So I'm going to be talking about fascinating research by Baker and Bellis. It's fascinating, but it is definitely not pretty, right? Or, it's quite messy, actually, right? They collected ejaculate from condoms and from flowback that was collected, right? So what is flowback? It's the residual seminal fluid that's discharged after intercourse, right? So that's collected after sex, and what they do is they use it to count sperm, right, that the male introduced into the female. And the upshot is that men don't always produce the same amount of sperm every time they have sex, right? The male's body tailors the amount of sperm that's produced in ways that give them the best chance of winning the sperm competition, right? In particular, the man's body registers how much time it's been since they last had sex, right? But also, and more interestingly, how much time he's been in the company of this female. So to clarify that, let's think about two couples, right? Couple one and couple two. In both couples, they haven't had sex for a week, but couple one has been together most of that time, and couple two has not, right? They've been apart. The idea behind Baker and Bellis's conjecture is that because they've spent less time together, the male in couple two will introduce more sperm than the male in couple one. Since if they haven't spent all that time together, there's a greater probability that the female may have the sperm of a different male inside of her. Okay, so this is what they found. So the graph takes into account how much time it's been since the last ejaculation by the male. Obviously, that's going to affect the count, right? The more time it's been since the male last ejaculated, the more sperm that should be introduced, and that's what you see in the graph, right? But what you also see is a downward trend in the data depending on how much time they've spent together, right? Proportion of time together from 0 to 20, 21 to 40, 41 to 60, 61 to 80, and 81 to 100. And what we can see is that as it goes from 0 to 20% of the time to 81 to 100, men introduce less sperm, right? So the less time they've spent together, the more sperm they produce. Okay, so the amount of sperm that's produced depends on, one, the time since the last ejaculation, and the proportion of time that the couple has spent together. So more time means less sperm. So that's physiological evidence for a long history of short-term mating. We wouldn't have these characteristics if there wasn't a history of short-term mating in our species. I now want to turn to psychological evidence for a long history of short-term mating. So another way of phrasing this is, do men have adaptations that help them to solve the adaptive problems faced when pursuing a short-term mating strategy? And according to Buss, the answer is yes, right? And one powerful adaptation that men have is just flat out lust, right? Men have a strong desire for sex with a variety of partners. So in a paper that we'll be discussing a lot in this lecture, right, Buss and Schmitt, they found that for any given amount of time, whether it's a month, a year, a decade, or so on, men will report desiring a larger number of sex partners than women will. And this is what it looks like. So how many partners would you like in the next month, in the next 6 months, next year, over a lifetime? We can see men desire many more partners than women do. And as the time increases, the difference between the sexes increases as well. As far as lust is concerned, if you look at sexual fantasies, they also tend to be very different between men and women. Right? So what are male fantasies like? They often include strangers, they often include multiple partners, anonymous partners. They tend to be devoid of encumbering relationships, very little emotional elaboration, complicated plot lines, flirtation, courtship, and extended foreplay. And they're very visual fantasies as well. Right? There's much more focus on images rather than feelings or emotions. Now, women obviously also have fantasies like that sometimes, but less often than men. Women's fantasies often contain familiar partners, usually the men that they're already involved with romantically. And they also tend to place more emphasis on the personal and emotional characteristics of their partner rather than the sheer visual appearance. Right? So they emphasize tenderness, romance, and a lot more personal involvement. Another psychological adaptation is that men require less time before consenting to sex. So again, Buss and Schmitt, they asked people the following question: if the conditions were right, would you consider having sexual intercourse with someone you viewed as desirable if you knew the person for blank, right? And they filled in that blank with different time intervals, ranging from 1 hour all the way up to 5 years. And people had to rate the likelihood from -3 to +3, negative being definite in the no direction, positive numbers indicating the yes direction. And this is what they found. Okay, so we have time from 5 years all the way up to 1 hour. And we have likelihood of intercourse, 0 being neutral, positive numbers being yes, negative numbers being no. And for any time period less than 5 years, men are more likely to consent to sex. But the differences between males and females are magnified in the context of short-term mating, right? Knowing someone for just an hour, right? Men are only slightly disinclined to agree to sex, right? But for women, that is almost an impossibility, right? All right, so we've discussed so far the fact that men are more prone to engaging in short-term mating, that they have adaptations that motivate them to pursue this, although, as I said, men differ in their propensity. Now I want to shift focus to short-term mating from the perspective of women, right? And we have to admit that short-term mating is somewhat of a mystery for evolutionary psychologists. And the reason is because of the parental investment theory that's so powerful, right? It predicts that men should aggressively pursue short-term mating, right? Because it enhances their inclusive fitness, but not women, right? Because women don't increase the number of offspring that they have by mating as often and frequently as possible, right? So Darwin viewed women as coy, and they played the role of choosers while men did most of the pursuing. But we do know that many women actively, aggressively pursue short-term mating, right? In the US, for example, about 30% of women have affairs, brief flings, compared to 50% of men. So we have to ask, well, what are the potential benefits of short-term mating for women? If they do pursue it, what are the reasons, right? Because they're not going to be the same as the reasons that apply to men. Right. One possibility is the resource hypothesis, that it allowed ancestral women to accrue resources, right? Extra food, extra protection. These are things that she might get from mating with another man on the side. So what evidence is there for this? That resources play an important role in short-term mating. In short-term mating contexts, right, Buss and Schmitt found that women value signs that a man will immediately spend resources on her. Right, so 20 female subjects evaluated various characteristics for their desirability in a short-term or a long-term mate. And the characteristics included spending a lot of money early on, gives gifts early on, has an extravagant lifestyle. Right? How desirable are these things for a short-term mate, and how desirable are they for a long-term mate? And this is what they found. So spends a lot of money on me early on, gives gifts early on, extravagant lifestyle. Compare the means for short-term mating and long-term mating, right? Across the board, they're higher, right? The immediate extraction of resources is more desirable in a short-term mate than in a long-term mate. But aside from resources, women may get other benefits from short-term mating on the side. Right? And so Buss calls these genetic benefits. They include, first of all, enhanced fertility. Right, so let's say that a woman is in a long-term relationship and she has been trying to get pregnant for a long time, but isn't successful. Right, so the mate may be infertile. In this case, she may, be motivated to seek a backup mate to aid in conception. Right, which it's a very clinical sounding account, but it may actually be the case. Right? And let's say that a woman is in a long-term relationship, the mate is fertile, but isn't otherwise a very desirable mate. Let's say he's not very dominant, doesn't have a very good job, or just lacks a lot, may not be very attractive. In this case, a woman may engage in covert mating on the side in order to get superior genes for her offspring. Right? She may get a child with better characteristics than her current long-term mate has. While the current long-term mate may, if he doesn't find out, then he's going to provide resources to care for this child who ends up being nothing like him. Right, so do women have characteristics that lead them to be more likely to become fertilized by their lovers? Right, this would support the superior genes hypothesis. So according to Baker and Bellis, women often, at least unconsciously, manipulate the sperm competition in a way that favors their mate on the side instead of their husbands or long-term boyfriends. Right, so they manipulate the sperm competition to increase the probability that their lovers will impregnate them. How is that? A couple ways. First of all, has to do with the frequency of extra pair copulations, right? Those matings on the side. So they distinguish between extra pair and intra pair copulation. But the frequency of extra pair copulations is greater when women are at their most fertile phase of their cycle, just before ovulation. And this ensures that women are going to have the sperm of their lovers inside when they are ovulating. Intra-pair copulations are more likely to happen outside of that fertile phase. Another thing that helps them to steer the war in the direction of benefiting the lover is that a woman having an affair is much more likely to reach orgasm with her lover than with her long-term mate, right? And you might think, well, what's the relevance of an orgasm, right? Well, orgasms affect sperm retention, right? When a woman orgasms, her uterus picks up more of the sperm and is introduced into the cervix, and it's just 5% more. But that's 5% when you're talking about millions of sperm. That's a huge increase in favor of the lover. Now, a third reason women might engage in short-term mating It's called the mate switching hypothesis. So the idea here is that women may use short-term mating as a way of initiating a breakup with a mate, or as a way of shopping around for a better mate. Right, so Greiling and Buss asked women what they thought the likely benefits would be of engaging, of having an affair. And many women said that one benefit is that it made it easier to break up with their current partner by breaking that emotional bond that they might have with them. And they also mentioned that it might be a useful way to find someone more desirable than their present partner. And fourth, we have the mate skill acquisition hypothesis. This applies more to younger women, right? So women may use short-term mating as a way of honing their mating skills, right? Seduction takes time to learn and master, and they may use short-term mating as a way of honing these skills. And the fifth reason why women may engage in short-term mating is called the mate manipulation hypothesis. Right, so they may have affairs as a way of getting something that they want out of their current mate. For example, they may want to exact revenge on something that the long-term mate did, or they want to make them jealous if they're not paying enough attention to them, right, as a way of increasing the commitment of their long-term mate. Now, with this last one, you might ask, well, how likely is this to work? Well, not very well, right? Especially since, remember, infidelity is one of the least desirable traits in a mate that, from the perspective of a man. But there you have it. So we have discussed short-term mating from the perspective of males and females. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to explore short-term mating from the perspective of females, but I'll let you read about that ongoing work in the textbook.